gas with the circulatory system, with the blood, the alveoli are going to be completely surrounded by capillaries. They have to be. We have to be able to get the gases out of the blood and put the gases that we want in. So if we look at the lungs of mammals, we see that we bifurcate here into the left bronchus and the right bronchus. Inside each of these lungs, we split into smaller and smaller tubes that are referred to as the bronchioles. Eventually, we get to a very small bronchiole where we have these sacs at the end that are the alveoli. This is where the gas exchange is going to take place, and each one of these is going to be surrounded by the capillary network. Now, in drawings, when they show blood, they either show it as blue or red. What does that mean? Oxygenated or deoxygenated. Which one is deoxygenated? The blue. So right here you can see we have deoxygenated blood coming in, surrounding this alveolus. It then passes over. It doesn't enter into the alveolus. We have an exchange of gas. Suddenly now the blood is oxygenated, and then it flows away from the lungs. In real life, do we have blue and red blood like this? No. All of our blood looks the same. We have students who, when they see someone bleeding, when they dissect an animal in the lab or something like that, they'll look and they'll say, well, where's the blue blood? Where's the red blood? I want to see what's nice and colored. It doesn't look like this. All blood looks the same. When we see blood, what color does it look like? Red. What's happening when we see blood? It's picking up oxygen. The brighter red the blood is, the more oxygen it has. But even in the circulatory system, the blood still looks the same, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. When we have a cut, when we're bleeding and it's bright red, that is because it's picking up a lot of oxygen from the atmosphere. So we have this system here. We conveniently show it as blue and red, but just remember that's not what it really looks like in the body. Now, I mentioned the birds are a little bit different. The birds have an extremely efficient respiratory system. Why do they need to have an efficient respiratory system? Flying takes a lot of energy. What do you need for energy? You need ATP. What do you need to make ATP? You need oxygen. So they need to have an extremely efficient respiratory system in order to get as much oxygen as possible from the atmosphere. Now, the way the lungs of the birds work is they actually have more subdivisions than we see in the mammals. The mammals, we go from the bronchi to the bronchioles to the alveoli, but then air moves back up those same tubes as it's being exhaled. With birds, they have subdivisions, air vessels that are called parabronchi. And these parabronchi are found in different locations in the bird's lungs, and this enables for unidirectional flow of the air across the lungs. What do we have every time we have unidirectional flow? The ability for more efficient processes. Just like we saw with unidirectional digestion, food moving in one direction, if we have unidirectional flow of air, we have a more efficient mechanism to try and extract oxygen. So the way that this works is the birds have anterior and posterior sacs that are separated from the actual lungs. And these anterior and posterior sacs are either found before the blood enters before the air enters the lungs, or after the air enters the lungs. Posterior and anterior. And this enables the birds to engage in a unidirectional flow. So when the birds are breathing in, their anterior sacs expand, they take in the air. When it's compressed, they're pushing the air out from these anterior sacs through the lungs, while the air that was in the lungs is then being pushed out through the mouth. So when they're breathing in, they're not actually breathing air into their lungs. They're breathing air into these sacs. So you can sort of break down bird respiration into two different cycles. The first cycle is when they inhale the air. The air is then stored from the trachea into these posterior air sacs. It is not entering the lungs when they breathe in. The air that was in the lungs leaves the lungs through the anterior air sacs and then out through the mouth. So we're creating a circuit. We still only have one entrance and exit, but we're creating a loop inside for unidirectional flow. The second cycle is now the air that is in the posterior air sacs is pushed from those sacs into the lungs, and then into the anterior air sacs. Those posterior air sacs are now empty, so the bird breathes in again to put air in those posterior sacs, and the air that is in the anterior sacs is exhaled. So you're always having air move in one direction across the lungs. That's going to allow for more efficient extraction of gases. Now, when you look at it, what you actually see is as the air is moving across, the blood is moving at a 90-degree angle from the airflow. What does this sound like? What do fish do? In fish, if you have the water moving in one direction, what's happening with the blood? Is it moving at 90 degrees to it? Yes? No? Should we pull out clickers?
It's a Monday.
How many people think yes? Moving at 90 degrees. How many people think no? Everyone's got an answer. How many people think yes? How many people think no? It's similar, but it's not exactly the same. With the gills, you have the water moving in one direction, the blood is moving in the opposite direction. It's referred to as countercurrent flow. And remember, that's to increase the ability of the blood to extract oxygen. This is a similar idea, but it's called a cross-current flow. So cross-current flow is, again, a mechanism to try and extract as much oxygen as possible. It's not as efficient as countercurrent flow. But it is more efficient than if the blood and the oxygen were flowing in the same direction. So we have a more efficient mechanism in order to extract oxygen. Is it as efficient as the fish? No. The fish have the most efficient respiratory organ around. But this is more efficient than we see with other terrestrial vertebrates. They can get more oxygen from the atmosphere, from the air that they're breathing, than reptiles can, than amphibians can, and than mammals can. So this is sort of what it looks like. Here's a bird. You have the trachea here. You have the posterior air sacs. You have the anterior air sacs. You have the lung in between. So what happens is when the bird breathes in, this is represented by the red line here, the red air. It moves into those posterior air sacs. It doesn't pass across the lungs. It's then stored in the posterior air sacs. The air that was in the lungs is pushed into the anterior air sacs and then pushed out. That air that is the new air that is in the posterior air sac is then pushed across into the lungs. From there, the second cycle across, it moves from the lungs into the anterior air sac. When the bird breathes in again, we get new air moving into the posterior air sac. When the bird breathes out, the air that is in the anterior air sac is exhaled. So we always have this flow of air in one direction across the lungs. Unidirectional, more efficient mechanisms to try and extract oxygen. So what's actually going on? The reason why we're doing this is for the gas exchange. Once air enters the lungs, that's when you have this gas exchange process take place. That's the whole purpose. Regardless of whether it's moving into air sacs, whether it's being pushed into the lungs, pulled into the lungs, the purpose is to get it in these lungs so that we can start exchanging the gas. Now, gas exchange is driven by differences in the pressures between the gases in the atmosphere and the gases in the blood. This sounds very similar to what we were talking about with what's moving water in plants, and the idea is the same. You're going to have different pressures, and that's going to control how these gases are moving. When you have gases in the blood, so the blood is returning from systemic circulation, meaning it's been going around the body, the oxygen has been being pulled out, so we're using up the oxygen in the blood, and it is then moving to the lungs to try and pick up more oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen, or PO2, in that blood is about 40 millimeters of mercury. That's how we measure partial pressure, with millimeters of mercury. Now, in the air around that's being now entered the alveoli, so as we're breathing in and we're breathing in that air, the partial pressure of oxygen there is about 105 millimeters of mercury. So how is air going to move? How is oxygen going to move? Does it move from low partial pressure to high partial pressure, or high partial pressure to low partial pressure? It moves from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So where's the higher partial pressure? In the blood or in the air? Hey, pull out your flickers. If you think the partial pressure is higher in the blood, answer A. If you think the partial pressure is higher in the air, answer B.
No, if it's going from the blood, it's coming from the air to be. I think it's in the air.
I don't know in the blood.
10 seconds left. All right, let's see what everyone says. Little bit of each. What did I just say? What is this saying right here? Blood. Returning from the systemic circulation. Is that going to be in the air or is that going to be in the blood?
Blood.
That's going to be in the blood. What is the partial pressure there?
40.
40. Partial pressure in the alveoli. Where is that from? What's in the alveoli? Air. Where is that coming from? Outside. So that's the partial pressure in the air. What is that partial pressure? 105. So where is the partial pressure higher? Air. The answers are right in front of you folks, okay? There's no reason why anyone should not get that question right. So the partial pressure is higher in the air for oxygen than it is in the blood. It moves from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So oxygen is going to move from the air in the alveoli to the blood. What do you think is going on with carbon dioxide? Where do you think the partial pressure is going to be higher?
In the blood?
In the blood. Because there's a buildup of carbon dioxide. That's a waste product of cellular respiration. So the partial pressure of oxygen, or partial pressure of carbon dioxide is building up in the blood. The blood is absorbing the carbon dioxide until eventually it has a relatively high partial pressure. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is going to be relatively low. So that's going to cause carbon dioxide to leave the blood and enter the alveoli. So it's a way for us to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So the blood that leaves the lungs now has picked up, because of this gas exchange, it's picked up more oxygen. It now has a higher partial pressure of oxygen than the blood that is entering the lungs. The partial pressure of the blood for oxygen leaving the lungs is about 100 millimeters of mercury. So we can actually measure how much oxygen is being picked up by the blood. This is what we see when what's going on, sort of. This is a breakdown of the circulatory and respiratory system. We have the heart. We have the lungs. We have the systemic tissues. So we have blood going to the lungs, either the left or the right lung. The partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is 40 millimeters. In the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen is 105. So we have oxygen going from the lungs to the blood. When it leaves, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 millimeters of mercury. The exact opposite is occurring with carbon dioxide. When the blood enters the lungs, it has a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of about 46 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the lungs is 40 millimeters of mercury. Not as much of a difference, but there still is a difference. So we have carbon dioxide that's going to be leaving the lungs, leaving the blood, entering the lungs for exhalation. When the blood leaves, we end up with a partial pressure of carbon dioxide at about 40 millimeters of mercury. So the body's more interested, or rather it's easier for the body to be pulling oxygen in because the difference between the partial pressures is higher. But the body can still be losing carbon dioxide because we have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood relative to the air that's in the alveoli. As the blood then moves around, it goes through the systemic system. We have the same kind of blood flow going based on what's going on inside the cells. It's all due to partial pressure. Eventually, we end up with blood that has less oxygen and more carbon dioxide. That is then going to be flowing back to the lungs. That is how the gas exchange takes place, driven by these partial pressures. Make sure you understand what's going on, how the partial pressures are driving this process. Wherever there's a higher partial pressure, the gas is going to move from the high partial pressure to the low partial pressure. Now, the lungs themselves are covered by what's referred to as a visceral pleural membrane. There's a visceral pleural membrane that was made of epithelial tissue that completely surrounds the lungs. The inside of the thoracic cavity is also covered by a pleural membrane, except it's referred to as a parietal pleural membrane. So we have these two pleural membranes. As I mentioned, the capillaries do not actually enter into the lungs themselves. They don't go into the alveoli. They simply surround it. The capillaries are going to be in this parietal pleural membrane. The space between these two membranes is called the pleural cavity. And when you want to have gas exchange take place, if you think back to Fick's law of diffusion, what's one way that we can increase the rate of gas exchange? Pressure. Pressure is one way. What's one way related to these two membranes?
Surface area?
Not surface area. We have the visceral pleural membrane on one side. This is where the gas is going to be. We have the parietal pleural membrane on the other side. This is where the gas wants to go. What can we do? Decrease the distance between them. That's going to speed up the rate of diffusion. Now, when we have these membranes, one way that we can decrease the distance is if we have a layer of liquid between them. So this area between them is going to be very small. It's filled with a fluid. This causes these two membranes to adhere together, to become in direct contact with each other. If it wasn't filled with a fluid, then they would be able to be spreading apart. But because we have this, the cavity filled with fluid, it causes these membranes to adhere together. If they're adhered together, that's as small as a distance as we can have, so that's going to increase the rate of diffusion. So this direct contact of these two membranes makes sure that diffusion is one of the ways that we can make sure diffusion is going to occur as fast as possible. Decreasing the distance across which diffusion takes place is going to increase the rate of diffusion. Now we're going to do an experiment. I want everyone to take a deep breath and then exhale that deep breath. Think about what's going on. When do you feel more relaxed while or after taking this breath? Is it when you're breathing in? Is it when you're breathing out? Do you feel relaxed all the time, breathing in and breathing out? Or do you not feel relaxed at all? You're just too hyper. Talk it over. Well, actually, you probably don't need to talk it over because no one can tell you when you do feel relaxed, but try it a couple times. Tell me when you feel the most relaxed. Is it breathing in? Or is it breathing out?
I know.
Yeah, breathing in. Breathing in feels good too. Meditation. Yeah, I guess you could say it's breathing. Breathing out.
Shouldn't take that long. Cut a few minutes. Check it out here. Try it a couple times. See when you feel more relaxed. Nothing else. Deep breaths wake you up in the morning, which I feel a lot of you may need this morning. Here we are. 10 seconds left. Let's see what everyone says. Oh, we didn't have any hyper people. Okay. So most people are saying that you feel more relaxed when you breathe out. You breathe in, there's a little bit of tension there. I'm trying to hold my breath as I'm doing this. There's a little bit of tension. There's a little pressure to try and breathe out. When you breathe out, more relaxed. There's less muscle stress. And this is, by design, the way the lung system, the way the respiratory system works. There are two primary reasons we do feel more relaxed when we're exhaling. The first of these has to do with what's going on with the muscle. During the process of inhalation, there are two muscle sets that are actually contracting. Now, when do you have muscles that are more, when do you feel more relaxed? When muscles are contracting or when muscles are relaxed? When muscles are relaxed. If they're contracting, you're using those muscles. You're tensing those muscles. It causes more tension. So during the process of inhalation, there are actually two muscle sets that are contracting. One of these is the external intercostal muscles. These surround the rib cage and they contract to expand the rib cage. What does this do? Well, it decreases the pressure in the rib cage, it decreases the pressure in the lungs to pull that air in. The other set of muscles that are contracting are the diaphragm muscles. The diaphragm muscles are contracting, pulling the thoracic cavity down. It increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Again, this decreases the pressure to pull the air in. So these muscles are contracting to try and pull the air into the system. We're still using muscles just the same way the amphibians did, but they were pushing the air in. We are pulling it in. So during the process of breathing in, we have these two sets of muscles that contract. When we breathe out, these two sets of muscles relax. So we have a natural state of relaxation that occurs during breathing out. So that those muscles contracting produces this negative air pressure. The second reason that we feel more relaxed when we're breathing out is because of what's actually going on in the thorax and the lungs. As the lungs and the thorax are expanding, there is a degree of elasticity. They basically are swelling up like a balloon. So the expansion that occurs of the lungs during the inhalation process puts these structures in tension. You're expanding them just like you are a balloon, creating a tension. So when there's this tension, that decreases the sense of relaxation. When that tension is released, as you exhale, the tension decreases, and it increases the sense of relaxation. So you have the muscles relaxing, you also have this elastic tension relaxing. So those are the two reasons why your body feels more relaxed when you're breathing out than when you're breathing in. So altogether, this produces a very forceful or an unforced exhalation. When you breathe in, it feels like you're forcing. There's a limit there. But when you're breathing out, it's not a force pushing the air out. It's a relaxation process. If you look at what's going on in the lungs with the inhalation, you have the diaphragm muscles pulling down, you have the intercostal muscles pulling the rib cage out. This creates a negative pressure inside the lungs. Those expand, increasing the tension on the lungs. During exhalation, you have the muscles relaxing. This is going to then be pushing the air back out. You have a decrease in the tension and the elasticity of the lungs. So overall, that's going to create a sensation of being more relaxed. Now, every time you breathe, it's initiated by neurons. Breathing is controlled by neural activity. You have a respiratory center in the medulla oblongata. This is controlling the breathing rate. So every time you breathe, there are certain neurons that are initiated to cause this contraction of muscles, to create this negative air pressure to pull some air in. These neurons stimulate the intercostal muscles. They stimulate the diaphragm to contract. This causes the inhalation process. The reason why this is more efficient is because with the amphibians, they have to first get some air in that buccal cavity before they can start the breathing process. They have to basically almost swallow some air. Then once that air is in the buccal cavity, then you can have muscles contracting and pushing that air in to their lungs. But the way our system works, you can just have these muscles contract, and that is automatically going to stimulate this process of inhalation. Now, when the neurons stop producing their signals, that then causes the muscles to relax. It causes the air to be expelled. So that is sort of what is regulating this breathing process. It's the respiratory center producing these signals that cause the muscles to contract, then stopping the signals that causes the muscles to relax. Now, the muscles that are controlling this breathing are normally controlled automatically. But does this mean they can or cannot be controlled voluntarily? Can you change what you're doing breathing?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hold your breath? My 9-year-old daughter certainly can when she doesn't get her way. We can override this automatic system. We are able to supersede and say, okay, I want to breathe in now, I want to breathe out now. We did that a couple seconds ago with the experiment in class. Normally you don't have to think about it, which is good because we probably would forget sometimes. But normally it's all autonomic. Normally it's not under voluntary control. But we can override the system and it can be controlled voluntarily. Now, a lot of people say, well, what happens if you hold your breath and hold your breath and hold your breath and pass out? What do you think is going to happen then?
Start breathing.
You're going to start breathing again. The autonomic system is going to start kicking in again. So you can override it. You can limit your ability to take breaths. You can speed up your breathing, but eventually the autonomic system is going to take over and control it again. Now, one of the reasons these neurons work so efficiently is because what they're actually sensing is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. If you think back to when we were talking about the regulatory systems or the regulation of the vertebrate body, we talked about things like the sensors, the effectors, and so forth. Well, here we have the neurons, and what they're actually sensing is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. They're using this as the information to how to regulate breathing. What does the partial pressure of carbon dioxide tell us? What if it's increasing? We're getting too much carbon dioxide in the blood. What do you think is going to happen?
Exhale.
Exhale, breathe in, getting dizzy. Well, think of it in more general sense, not in the specific breath. But if we're building up too much carbon dioxide, what does the body need to do? It needs to get rid of that carbon dioxide. Is one breath going to do it? No. So what that's going to do is actually going to start to increase the rate of respiration, start to increase the rate at which we're breathing. When we build up the carbon dioxide, the neurons detect that there's this buildup, and that is what triggers the speed or the increase in speed of breathing. So a rise in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases the rate of carbonic acid production, lowering the pH of the blood. This is actually what the neurons are detecting. This stimulates the chemosensory neurons in the regulatory system. Those are then in turn going to send impulses to the respiratory control center to say, hey, you need to start breathing more quickly. The blood pH is dropping. It means that we're building up too much carbon dioxide. We need to breathe more rapidly to get rid of this carbon dioxide. So when we start detecting that, that's when we start breathing more rapidly. What kind of activities are going to produce this higher level of carbon dioxide? Exercise. When you're active. When you're active, you're using up ATP. ATP uses oxygen. It produces carbon dioxide. That's going to increase the rate of carbon dioxide. So in 1401, we talked about how when you do exercise, you start breathing more rapidly to try and get rid of carbon dioxide, try and bring in more oxygen. This is what's actually controlling that process. This is what's actually in your body is determining, hey, it's time to start breathing more rapidly. Now, there are other chemoreceptors that are responsible for changes in different kinds of pH because carbon dioxide can actually control pH in other areas as well. But the primary one for controlling the respiration is with these chemosensitive neurons that are found in the aortic and carotid bodies. So if you look at what's going on, this is sort of how the sensory system works. We have a variety of stimuli that can be detected. We have the sensors that are detecting those. We have an effector. What is the response going to be? It's going to be things like increasing or decreasing the breathing rate. So it's a very efficient mechanism to make sure that we get the oxygen we need to make sure we're getting rid of the carbon dioxide that we don't want. Now, how does the gases, once they enter the capillaries, how do they get moved around? Well, they're moved around through the circulatory system. This is why I mentioned that the circulatory system is tied very closely to the respiratory system. The hemoglobin that's in the circulatory system is a molecule that's directly responsible for transporting oxygen to the different cells in the body. Hemoglobin itself is comprised of 4 polypeptide chains. There are 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains, and they're linked together. So if you think about sort of protein structure, when we talked in 1401, you have primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary structure, quaternary structure. What kind of structure is this hemoglobin here? What is primary structure? It's the sequence of amino acids, just that chain of amino acids. The order of those amino acids is the primary structure. What's the secondary structure? Alpha pleated sheaths and beta spirals. So those are the or alpha spirals or beta pleated sheaths. Those are the secondary structure. What's the tertiary structure? You have this sequence of amino acids. It starts to fold in on itself. That's the tertiary structure. What's the quaternary structure? When you have multiple subunits that link together. So what kind of structure is this? Quaternary structure. Way back in 1401, I said biology builds upon itself. You need to know a little bit of everything in order to understand biology. So when we talk about hemoglobin, we talk about these polypeptide chains. Each chain is a tertiary structure. The hemoglobin itself is the quaternary structure. All of these chains link together. Now, each chain is associated with what we refer to as a heme group. The heme group has a central iron atom, and this iron is absolutely critical because it is what binds to the oxygen. When oxygen enters the blood through this diffusion because of partial pressures of oxygen, it's going to bind to the iron in each of these heme groups. So how many molecules of oxygen can each hemoglobin take? 4, because there's 4 chains. Each chain has a heme group. So hemoglobin can load up with oxygen at the lungs. Once it does that, we refer to it as oxyhemoglobin. All that means is that it's hemoglobin that is now carrying oxygen. So if you see the word oxyhemoglobin, you should think to yourself, it's just hemoglobin that's carrying an oxygen molecule. It picked up that oxygen at the lungs and it's carrying it somewhere else. Now, some molecules eventually will lose their oxygen as the blood passes through capillaries in the systemic system. The partial pressures of oxygen, again, control the diffusion. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but what happens is the oxygen flows from the blood into the tissues. That's where it's trying to go. It's trying to be moving to the tissues. But once the hemoglobin loses that oxygen, it then is referred to as deoxyhemoglobin. So in your bloodstream, you either have oxyhemoglobin or deoxyhemoglobin. The hemoglobin either has an oxygen or has 4 oxygens, which in this case is referred to as oxyhemoglobin, or it's lost its oxygen, in which case it's referred to as deoxyhemoglobin. All the hemoglobin is either going to be oxy or deoxy. This is what hemoglobin looks like. You can see the heme group in each of the 4 chains. We have 2 alpha chains, 2 beta chains. The oxygens are going to bind to these heme groups. Now, just as we have transport of oxygen, we also have transport of carbon dioxide. The cells are producing carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide needs to be moved from those cells into the bloodstream, from the bloodstream into the lungs so it can be exhaled. So ultimately, the carbon dioxide that's being produced has to be sent to the lungs. Now, some of the carbon dioxide that's produced ends up dissolved in the bloodstream itself, in the plasma. That's about 8%. As it's dissolved in the plasma, that plasma moves to the lungs as well, so that's one way that it can be transported. Carbon dioxide can also bind to hemoglobin just the same way as oxygen can. It's not as efficient, but it is capable of doing that. About 20% of the carbon dioxide that's produced is going to bind to hemoglobin. So that's about 28%. We still have 72% of the carbon dioxide that's being produced that needs to be picked up somehow. And the way this is moved is the remaining 72% actually diffuses into the blood cells themselves. They don't bind with the hemoglobin, but they actually diffuse into the cell. Then there's a series of chemical reactions that take place. The first thing that happens is once the carbon dioxide diffuses into the cell, you have an enzyme that's referred to as carbonic anhydrase. This takes the carbon dioxide, combines it with water, H2O, to form an acid, carbonic acid, H2CO3. So this takes place inside the blood cells. H2CO3 then dissociates into a hydrogen ion, H+, and HCO3-, a negative ion. The hydrogen ion is then able to bind to any deoxyhemoglobin, those hemoglobins where the heme group does not have an oxygen bound to it. But this still leaves an HCO3-. That's floating around inside the cell. So the HCO3- actually then moves out of the blood and into the plasma. And this is what causes the decrease in pH. A decrease in pH is going to be associated with the production of this carbonic acid. So as you produce more carbon dioxide, you're producing more of this carbonic acid. That's going to decrease the pH of the blood. That's going to tell the respiratory center you need to start breathing more. Now, when it's moving out, you also have to have an ion exchange. So as the HCO3 moves out, you have a chloride ion that moves in. This is called the chloride shift. You don't want to build up an electrochemical gradient, so you're sort of moving and keeping the electrical charges the same. But if you look what's going on inside the tissues, you have the carbon dioxide being produced. Some of it dissolves into the plasma. Some of it is picked up by the heme group. Most of it dissolves into the cells where you have this chemical reaction taking place. When the blood then goes to the capillary, or to the alveoli, you actually just have a reverse of this chemical reaction take place. The HCO3 moves back into the cells, the chloride ion moves out. The H+ proton dissociates with the heme group. It combines with the HCO3- to produce the carbonic acid. Water is removed from the carbonic acid to produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then diffuses out of the blood cell into the alveoli. And that is where the carbon dioxide that we exhale comes from. So as it's moving through the pulmonary capillaries, the capillaries that are directly connected to the alveoli, the only thing that happens is you have a reverse of that chemical reaction. Taking that carbonic acid, converting it back into carbon dioxide, sending that outside the lungs. So this produces that carbon dioxide gas. There is not usually a lot of carbon dioxide itself in the blood. Most of the carbon dioxide has been converted into this carbonic acid. Now there are other gases that are dissolved and transported by hemoglobin. Some of those may be exchanged as well. It's not just oxygen and carbon dioxide, but the respiratory system is there primarily to move these two gases around. Other gases include things like nitric oxide and carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a poison gas. It does kill us. We do produce it. We do need to get rid of it. So we do exhale some carbon monoxide. There are other gases that move around. So that brings us to the end of the respiratory system. Next, we'll talk about the circulatory system. We'll start with that on Wednesday. If you have any questions, please let me know.